Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Today, I'm very glad to be joined by Dr. Sidney Finkelstein. He is the Stephen Roth Professor of Management and Director of the Center for Leadership at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College, where he teaches courses on leadership and strategy. He is also the faculty director of the flagship Tuck Executive Program and has experience working with executives at a number of prestigious universities around the world. He has published 20 books and 80 articles. His latest book, which he published back in 2016, is Superbosses: How Exceptional Leaders Master the Flow of Talent. Welcome to the program today, Sidney. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Charles. Looking forward to our chat.
Great. So we're going to be talking about Superbosses today, the topic of your latest book. What got you interested in this topic and why did you choose it?
So there's a long answer, but I'll give you the shorter answer to that. An earlier book that I had written that became a big global bestseller called Why Smart Executives Fail led to me traveling everywhere, including working with IMS over the years as well on that topic. And I was giving a lot of talks and consulting, et cetera, et cetera. And I kept getting a question that I thought I had answered in the book, but because I kept getting it, it was clear that I had not fully answered that question. And that was, okay, now I understand what could go wrong. I know how we could fail. I know some of the things we should do to avoid that failure. But how do you thrive? How do you survive? How do you succeed into the long term? What is really the key there? And it got me thinking about that. And of course, it always ends up being about people. And I drilled down and started looking around for people that had a track record of generating and regenerating talent on a continual basis, because that's really the essence of it, right? It's not just hiring people for your team. It's not just hiring at one time. Companies change, businesses change, people come and go, and you have to develop a system in place. And so I was looking for people that had done this and done it really well. And I started finding them, and they became these people that eventually I ended up coining the term Superboss. It's just combining two words together. It wasn't in the dictionary before. I hope it shows up in the Oxford Dictionary next year. And so that's where it came from, kind of just continually learning and listening to people who were telling me something that I had not fully appreciated how important it was.
Thank you for providing that insight. And in the book, you profile 18 different superbosses. Do they come from one industry, or did you look at one industry in particular first, or were you looking for them everywhere?
I'm a big foodie. I love that whole foodie scene. And as I was searching for, again, as I said, these people with a track record of generating and regenerating talent on a continual basis, I knew about Alice Waters, legendary chef Alice Waters from Chef Benny's restaurant, the woman credited for the most part with inventing California cuisine, farm to table, locally sourced organic food. And I was interested in her. And I also knew that she had so many people that have worked in her restaurant over the years, both in the back of the house, chefs and others, and then front of the house, people in the finance side or service side. And it turns out this is kind of unbelievable. Over 250 people that work for Alice Waters at some stage in their career. Those people, over 250 of them, went on tremendous success in their own careers doing all sorts of stuff, whether it's opening up their own restaurant, whether it's creating bakeries, this is also kind of cool. Some of the early people that work there have subsequently become big players in private equity and venture capital in the food industry, food and coffee industry. And so she had this kind of incredible impact on people. She was someone with that track record of generating talent. And then I kept looking because that was kind of interesting. And I looked at the NFL, which is great because there's a lot of data about every sport. NFL is no exception. I was interested in coaches, and I wanted to know which coaches were the most influential in the history of the NFL with respect to their ability to hire great assistant coaches that went on to become head coaches themselves. And I did that, and I created these trees of talent that describe each of the major coaches. In fact, what I looked at is people that were in the Super Bowl, teams that were in the Super Bowl, and the two head coaches. And I use that as a key metric. And it turns out that when you do that, Bill Walsh, the former coach of the San Francisco 49ers, multiple Super Bowls, turns out he was the most influential. He had so many, and still has to this day, many proteges that were assistant coaches for him that have become head coaches, successful coaches, Super Bowl winning and appearing head coaches. And then I was kind of off and running, and I started looking at all kinds of industries, hedge funds. Julian Robertson from Tiger Management, Tiger Cubs, David Swenson at Yale University for endowments, incredible how many people work for him that run endowments at major universities and philanthropies. Ralph Lauren in fashion, Lauren Michaels in comedy. I don't know, goes on and on in so many different industries. And what was kind of fascinating is that it didn't matter what industry or sector I was looking at. With some research and talking to a lot of people, I was able to identify who that one, sometimes two, who those key people were that had this incredible capability. And then I wanted to capture it, right? I wanted to understand who they were, what they did, and especially kind of how they do it. And that's the essence of it. I mean, that's what everybody wants to know. How do I do that? Because not only do they have this track record developing great talent, let's remember a couple other key attributes of superbosses. They see potential in others often before they see it themselves. They help accelerate careers. They lead among the most successful companies or organizations in their entire industry, in their entire sector. They have a tremendous track record, and we shouldn't be surprised that they would be higher performers. You know, if you surround yourself with great talent, how is it not possible that you yourself won't be more successful? And so these were the superbosses, and I wanted to know what they did and how they did it.
I love how they cross so many different industries. You mentioned some famous names. And in the book, you identify 3 types of superbosses. So I hope you can go into each one of those types and maybe identify an example of each type. Because the 3 types are the iconoclast, the glorious bastards, and the benevolent nurturer. And you found that certain famous individuals in each one of those classes, but perhaps you can unpack each one of those classes. And like I said, just identify someone that really fits that type.
So yes, there were 3 types. I'm going to kind of jump the gun slightly and tell you, even though these are different personality types, so much of what they did is similar, which is kind of unbelievable, right? Which also implies that anyone could do this as well, as I know we'll talk about. So the type of person most people think about when they hear me kind of describe what super bosses are these nurturing leaders. You know, the people that they value the success of the people on their team. It means something to them. Of course, they want to be successful in their business. They want to hit their KPIs. They want to advance their own career, but they gain value by helping other people get better. And there are plenty of those people. I already mentioned Alice Waters was absolutely somebody like that, kind of the classic. But you know what? Not everyone is like that. You mentioned, that second category, iconoclasts. Iconoclasts are kind of the more creative types. So Ralph Lauren would certainly qualify that way. And the motivation here is a little bit different. It's not that, and by the way, Miles Davis, legendary jazz band leader and trumpeter, is also a classic example of the iconoclast superboss. It's not that they don't care about people, but what they care about more is their art, if you will, their creativity. And as a result, they surround themselves with really, really great people, high potential talent that help push them to accomplish more and more. And along the way, anyone who's in that circle, of course, also benefits. And you look at somebody like Ralph Lauren, the number of his proteges that become household names, kind of amazing. Vera Wang and Tory Burch, another billionaire, actually, John Barbados, Joseph Abboud, John Idle, who ran Michael Kors for years and years. And so these are the iconoclasts. And then the third category, kind of the ones most people don't think, and they're not as many, but there were certainly some of them, and I call them glorious bastards. And what makes them glorious is that if you can handle it, because your feet are on the fire, if you can handle working for someone like this, then your career is just going to accelerate. And a classic example is Larry Ellison, the longtime CEO of Oracle, who is known as being one of the toughest people out there. And he would just drive people really, really hard. And the truth is, it's not for everyone. Not everyone can handle it. Not everybody wants that. But if you could, people that I interviewed who worked for Larry Ellison, they talked about it as kind of dog years, right? If you work for Larry Ellison for 1 year, it's like working for someone else for 7 years. It was that intense. But what makes them glorious here, right? Well, it turns out that their motivation is all about themselves, but not like the iconoclasts in terms of creativity, but they want to win. Larry Ellison wants to win. That's what he cares about. He cares about winning more than anything else. But this is the key thing. He knows that in order to accomplish all of his incredible goals, all of his own potential, he knows that he's got to surround himself with great talent and keep pushing them to get better and better and better. And it's important to point out that that's a difference from another type of bastard that certainly is not glorious. And that's the one that only wants to win also, but then uses everybody around them and doesn't really see any reason why they even need a strong team. It's just somebody to go do what they tell them to do. That's a really big difference. So you see the motivation is I mean, it's different for each of these three people. But as I said or alluded to, they took so much of the same thing.
Thank you for unpacking those three types. My next question really, are these super bosses, are they only found in large organizations or can they be in different size companies as well? What have you found from your research?
So super bosses they're everywhere. And it doesn't really matter how big the company is. I personally chose to study pretty, large enterprises and often very, very famous people. And that was part of the kind of the strategy to learn about it. You could identify them a little bit easier from the outside. But what I discovered is that there are super bosses in every organization around. I don't think there are enough of them, but they're there. And how did I discover that? Well, pre-pandemic, I was out, giving lots of talks and book signings, and people would come up to me and say, "Thank you so much. Now I know that my boss is a super boss. Could you sign the book over to that person?" And it's somebody I never heard of in a company I barely knew existed. And it happened time and time and time again. And so it's not about the size of the company. It's not about the level you are in the company as well. Anyone who has team members, people that are part of their team. And by the way, this is even relevant for individual contributors because you're interacting kind of on a peer level with a lot of people. You can use some of the same techniques. But to answer your question, there are super bosses in every type of industry, every type of organization, large, small, and actually different countries as well.
And that's so important. That distinction that you made is at any leadership level as well, right? It's not just your CEO or senior executive. Anyone can have these qualities and nurture these qualities along because you believe, which I tend to agree with as well, is that anyone can become one. They aren't born, they can be made if they follow certain practices, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's one of those things that people always kind of start to stumble on and they think, are leaders born or made? It's the oldest question people ask, right? I wouldn't be in this business if I thought leaders were born because what can I do? Nothing. But I've been doing things like this for 40 years. And I can tell you that I have seen and occasionally even been fortunate enough to help leaders go to a whole other level. It just requires people who want to learn, who want to start to think a little bit differently and really want to go for it. You know what I mean? You need the aspiration to start to do something different because some of what super bosses do is not standard for every leader. And you got to be willing to do that.
That's great. So if you're early in your career, now you can develop and nurture some of these, but what would be your advice if you're early in your career? Would it be trying to nurture these or looking for someone to work for that is a super boss?
Yeah, this is probably the most common question I get from students and my own MBA students for that matter. The power of having a boss. And, people that are watching this or listening to this, they could think about their bosses at various times in their careers. And hopefully everyone can think of someone that's had this kind of outsized impact and you never forget that person. That's what you want to do. You want to try to find as many of those as you can because there's so much to learn from them. And I actually have a couple of tips on how to do that. It's not a foolproof tip because you got to, it's not like magic, but there are a couple of things you can do. So for example, if you're in a company already, you want to look for where job openings, the pattern of job openings in different offices or other different team leaders. And you want to see what you discover with a super boss is that as soon as there's an opening in that team, it gets filled really, really fast because somehow people start to figure it out. Look, this is where the action is. This is who could help me get to the next level. And then the other thing you could do, which goes even earlier when you're interviewing for a job. And when you finally get to the stage where you're interviewing with your prospective boss, so not the HR people, not the recruiters, but your actual boss that you're going to potentially start with, you want to ask a very simple question, which is, could you share a little bit about some of the people that used to work for you and where they are today? And it's a trick question because if they don't know, they're not a super boss. Super bosses know who's worked for them and super bosses are okay with the idea of some people moving on and doing other things and accelerating their careers. And they're typically quite proud of it. So if they don't even have any inkling about that, then already it's a clue. And what you want to hear is, even if there's one or two examples about someone that worked for me for 5 years. And then she moved on to this position. And I just talked to her last month and she's doing great. I mean, that's the classic super boss answer you would get.
That's great. And also from what I gleaned from your book as well, they really stay connected to their alumni network. They want to have that connection. They're proud of those individuals who have moved on, who have done great things. And that's another distinguishing characteristic, as well as which I think is maybe counterintuitive to some individuals, is they spend time coaching, they spend time delegating and really sharing a compelling vision that's also characteristics of this group of individuals.
They're definitely teachers, which is a funny word, really, for people that are working, day and night to get their own KPIs on target. But they understand that the stronger their team, the stronger they're going to be. They're going to be themselves. The more they're going to be able to accomplish. The more you can delegate. Look, the number one reason why you see burnout in a company for a leader, I'm going to say maybe not always, but almost always bad delegation, because you don't have people to delegate to. You feel like you got to do everything. It's a very big mistake that first-time leaders, by the way, make when you're promoted from individual contributor to a supervisor or team leader. The biggest mistake that I've seen is believing that you've got to do all the work yourself, because by definition, you're better than everybody else because you're the one who got the promotion. They didn't get the promotion. You did. And that's just a disaster because you can't, you just can't do that. And so teaching and coaching is a very, very big part of what they do. And the payoff is that you end up with better teams.
Well, and delegation is so important, you're right, to new and emerging leaders that are coming into the fold, because they do feel, like you mentioned, that they need to take on more and more because they got the position. And if they give away too much, they might be decreasing their value, right? And letting maybe the organization see that maybe they weren't the right choice because of all those things that they're delegating away, some of those things they really should be doing. What I found, though, is what's the differentiating mark is knowing what you're the best at and can provide the most value to the organization with, and then delegating the rest out so that you are uniquely positioned to provide that value, but not be overwhelmed, overworked by trying to take on too much.
Yeah, you're exactly right, I think, Charles. And in fact, you got to be good at something. You got to be expert at something, and you want to keep going deeper on that. And it makes, this is like the old theory of comparative advantage in economics. Each country should produce or do it where they have an advantage, and then they should be partnering or trading with other guys. It's the same idea for people.
Now, how about if you're an executive, you're a boss already, so you're not early in your career now. Now you want to elevate what you do. You want to elevate yourself to a super boss status. What are some advice that you would have for those individuals that really would like to take their leadership to the next level?
So I'll highlight maybe 2 or 3 habits or behaviors or techniques that Superboss leaders do as examples. And they're more than that, but these are some of the ones that are big. First, on motivation, how do they motivate people? They are kind of the yin and the yang of motivation. They create a performance-driven culture. They push people hard. It's not easy to work for any of the Superbosses, even the nurturing ones, because they have high expectations. Of course, many people live in that world today anyways, because people are driven pretty hard. But they create that performance-driven culture. But at the same time, they also inspire people to believe that there's nothing they can't do. And doing both of those things is really where the secret sauce is. Because if you have people on your team that you are demanding a lot of, and they got to work hard, why are they doing that? Yeah, they got a paycheck. But that's, especially today in the world we're in now, I'm going to call it optimistically post-COVID, but a lot of people working from home, et cetera, et cetera. You have to give more. You have to offer more. And it's that inspiration. And that's got to be authentic. People will receive, people will see right through any kind of soft talk that somebody's got. And being able to do both at the same time is something that Superbosses do very, very well. So that's the first thing you can think about. And then the second thing I would say, and this is a really powerful one, is customizing how they work with each person in their team. And by that, I mean, everyone is different. We kind of know that, but somehow we sometimes think we got to treat everyone exactly the same because of fairness. But that's not fair to do exactly the same thing for everyone when person A really needs some more handholding on a project and person B wants to have more leeway, as one example. And so you need to spend the time with each individual, and you're not going to have a ton of time. We understand that, but you need to spend the time to truly understand who they are, what makes them tick, how do they like to work, what's their motivation for their job, what are they good at, as you said earlier as well, because you want to kind of double down on things that they can really contribute. And the other thing they do, which is maybe a bit more unusual, is they'll spend some time talking to people on their team to understand what those team members really want for their own careers, their own lives, which you don't always see. So for example, you have someone on the team who says, you have to build a relationship to get some honesty out of that conversation. But then says, well, actually what I want to do is kind of create my own thing. The next step for me down the line is to do some entrepreneurial thing because I really know a lot about this technology or this market or what have you. And what the super boss leader does is not, oh, this guy is leaving or this woman is leaving and this is a waste of time. Quite the opposite. The super boss will say, okay, if that's what you want to do, let's think about the skill sets, the capabilities, the experiences you need to put yourself into a position to actually make that happen. And over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, let's create those. Let me put you into some of those opportunities. Let me introduce you to some people that could do this. And imagine the loyalty you get when you start to talk to people on your team. And this is, for top performers, you start to talk to people on your team about their potential. And what you've done is they are no longer working for you only. You're actually working for them, which is turning obviously the entire employment relationship on its head. And what you end up getting is tremendous loyalty. You get people staying longer than they otherwise would. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the core things that super bosses do that most leaders do not.
I love those two about motivation and customization. I'm going into a little bit more about motivating your employees. You have a great quote in the book by Michael Milken that stated that the super boss's general attitude about performance, and I'm quoting the book here, is maybe we set our objectives too low in school and in our daily lives. We're all capable of performing at a far higher level than we have. Faced with a challenge, we can do it. Maybe we're not challenging ourselves enough. And these super bosses, they really push others into discomfort zones because they model this high behavior themselves, correct?
Right. Yeah. I mean, they walk the talk. They're working as hard as anyone else. They're not giving people jobs to do and then they just take off and you know that they're there. They love to fulfill their potential. They understand, and this is kind of philosophical a little bit, but they understand, as we all know, we only have so much time in whatever we do and in our entire lives. Well, how do we want to spend that? Do you want to just kind of coast? Do you want to plateau? Which, by the way, plenty of people will do. And I don't have a problem with that if that's what you want. But for super bosses and people that want to work for super bosses, and now speaking personally about my own life and my own career, you want to go for it. You only get one chance. And that's what super boss leaders do. And they just energize people around them that love the opportunity. And by the way, it also means that you're not always going to hit it, right? You're going to fail sometimes. And super boss leaders also have a very creative way to think about failure. You can't be failing left and right. That doesn't work for anybody. But I'll tell you a quick anecdote. Jay Chiat, the founder of Chiat Day, is another one of the super bosses in the advertising industry. And he had a creative team that was presenting to a big client and they didn't get the contract. And the reason they didn't get the contract is they were a little bit more, avant-garde, a little bit more out there in their creativity. And so it's not good to not get the contract. But Jay Chiat said, this is the reason why, if we're not going to get the deal, this is the reason why I want us not to get the deal. This is a failure that is the right type of failure. Being too timid is not the failure that I want to see. And he actually rewarded everyone on that team. And imagine you just do that once and you're sending this incredible signal.
Well, and so importantly to motivating employees is to galvanize them around a vision that's compelling. And you mentioned Ralph Lauren, that his single-mindedness on purpose. Everyone else was moved from place to place, from trend to trend. He wasn't trendy. The single most important thing about him was his drive, his single-minded purpose that galvanized everyone around him to offer this compelling vision to them, get them moving in the right direction. And it's not because, for the fame, for the glory or the money, but they followed him because it was irresistible, the future that he was painting, correct?
It's really interesting because, some of these old cliches about, the train's leaving the station, I got to jump on. I kept hearing that from people I was interviewing that were, talking about 10 different people. And, there's a vision being conveyed that is so exciting that you just want to be part of it. And they jump on and they're willing to do that. And the interesting thing also to keep in mind when it comes to vision, that again, something I learned from the super bosses that I think many people don't understand is the job of vision is the job for every single manager in a company. If you have anyone on your team that reports to you, you have a responsibility to craft and to convey, to communicate what your vision is in your own little team. Now, of course, that vision is going to be aligned and tied into the overall vision of the company, of the organization. That's a definite, but still everyone needs to know. And it's a lost opportunity, I think. People will be, use the word galvanize. That's exactly right? They'll be energized, they'll be galvanized. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. When I've done, working with teams on this topic, the question I like people to try to answer is, why do we exist as a team? Which is not the friendliest question to ask. Why do we exist as a team? you got to have a good answer. If your answer to the question, why do we exist as a team, is because, we're trying to make a lot of money. Well, come on, we live in a capitalist society. I'm all for money, but if that's the best you could do, you're really leaving a lot of energy on the cutting room board, right? And so answering that question in a way that's meaningful, that's compelling, that's what vision is. People use words like mission and vision. They've been around forever. You can cut through a lot of that junk and just answer the question, why do we exist as a team? And when you come up with a compelling answer for that, all of a sudden people will buy into what you're trying to do.
Wonderful. And super bosses, just like great leaders, they're not motivated by money or becoming famous. They want to have an impact. They want to change their industry and even the world. And that's really what motivates them and provides that compelling vision for their subordinates. And they're also really open to change. And in your book, and I love how you describe this, is that when they're asked what should change and what should be kept the same, super bosses suggest a very simple solution. Protect the why of your business, but be prepared to constantly improve everything about the how of your business as your life depended on it.
Yeah. And I use the term uncompromisingly open to describe these super boss leaders. And the uncompromising is the why, right? What's the purpose? What's the fundamental vision of the organization? Alice Waters, why is she doing what she's doing in the restaurant business, the food industry? Because she wants to change how Americans eat. Ralph Lauren wants to kind of create the Great Gatsby as a model for clothes. George Lucas, so I didn't mention, another super boss, certainly at the time of Star Wars, when he's working on Star Wars, he wants to tell a story about a father and a son, a classic story that's been told before, but he wants to tell it in a way no one's ever told it before, which, as we know, he ended up doing. That's the uncompromising part. But then super boss leaders don't believe that they have a monopoly on all the answers. In fact, they're never more delighted. This is even true for Larry Ellison, who we talked about earlier as one of the toughest bosses. He was never more delighted than when somebody on the team would have a different point of view or would prove him wrong. And you got to be able to defend yourself, right? It's not just, oh, that's a great idea, I was wrong. No, you're gonna go toe to toe, and you're gonna have to be able to kind of make your point, provide the evidence. But if it turns out that there's a better way to do something, they're all for it. And at the heart of that is that there's kind of like a psychological profile or a personality characteristic there, which is they are incredibly secure as opposed to insecure. They're not threatened by ideas that are not consistent with things they've been doing, as long as they are consistent with the overall mission or vision of what they're trying to accomplish.
And it seems like that you agree with and mentioned in your book, they defy an easy categorization, right? They're uncompromising and open. They're virtual micromanagers and extreme delegators. So there's a lot of paradoxes with them, including they're also very collaborative, but they also encourage competition. How do they balance these paradoxes to become so successful?
So I loved learning about this and talking to the super bosses and talking to their proteges. I interviewed over 250 people for the project, for the book. And at a high level, what I learned is leadership is not linear. And that in and of itself is like a very big insight that most people don't get. And what I mean by that is if something's good for you, if it's good to be, let's say, confident, or it's good to delegate, then wouldn't it be better to do more of the same because it's good? And it turns out that's hardly ever true. I'm not going to say it's never true. I'm sure somebody can invent something, but it's hardly ever true. It's almost always a balance that's required because you can become too confident. You become too overconfident. You could delegate too much and not kind of be there as kind of a central player. And so the paradox is the reality of leadership. This is why it's not so simple to do this. You need to have, now I'm talking about almost a Zen quality here, right? To embrace paradox. And that's certainly what I found in all of those examples that you just shared.
Wonderful. And you are right. There's many paradoxes in leadership, and you don't want to operate at the extremes, but that to be balanced in those areas, those critical attributes is essential. Before we end today's episode, just want to give some bosses, some leaders, some tips that they could use, or maybe qualities that super bosses look for when they hire people. And you list 3 of those in your book, and I'd love for you to unpack those for our listeners so they can say, okay, what am I looking for in potential people that I bring in?
So we were interested in knowing who super bosses are attracted to as talent. And of course, given 18 different industries, there's tons of differences in kind of, skill set. but the commonalities were pretty clear. So first was intelligence, whether it's kind of raw IQ or emotional intelligence or both. They were attracted to kind of A-level talent, let's call it. And again, it's not just IQ. It might depends on the job and the person. Emotional intelligence is, as we know, incredibly important. And that's another place where they were uncompromising. They weren't interested in the B players, unless that B player had an aspiration to become an A+ player. They were okay with that because they love people with high aspirations. So there was intelligence. There was creativity. Another word, maybe we don't hear that much in business, but I think it's, we use the word innovation instead of creativity, but it's the same idea. They love creative people. And a bunch of the things that we've been talking about have an element of creativity as well, whether it's, going out of your comfort zone, coming up with new ways of thinking, this kind of paradox of leadership. It requires someone who can think a little bit differently. And Superboss leaders love people that are going to do their job, whatever that job is, and then add something else. And that something else is something they never thought of, or something that maybe no one really quite understood, or something to that effect. And that's where creativity comes up. And then the other thing that they look for is someone that could do multiple things. They like, in baseball, there's utility players, right? They could play first base, second base, and left field. And they love people like that, or at least have the potential. They want someone with deep expertise. They love people, obviously, you need people that have, specialized skills. We live in that type of world. But they're also pretty consistently will take someone from one area and move them into another that maybe they didn't have as much experience in. And what they want them to do is look at the world fresh and ask those kind of so-called dumb questions that people have been doing the same thing for a long time, no longer ask. Gene Roberts is a great example of that. He's former executive editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer that won something like 18 Pulitzer Prizes under his leadership and spawned so many great journalists. And he would take, someone that was doing, city desk work and put him or her on the investigative unit, move somebody from, entertainment to sports or to politics. And he wouldn't keep them there forever. I mean, if they can't do it, they can't do it. But he would challenge them. And one of the things that's a big driver of success is diversity of experience. And Superbosses give that to you. So those are the three things that kept coming up. I think intelligence, this way that I described it, creativity, and then this idea that you can do, or you're willing to try to do multiple things.
Ray, and that's sometimes overlooked with everyone looking for a specialist approach, is having that extreme flexibility of a generalist is also an advantage. And in the book, you also mention, many Superbosses make a special effort to extend their search for new employees into groups that other companies have overlooked, like Bill Walsh did when he was the coach of the San Francisco 49ers.
I call that untapped talent pools. And I found that to be one of the most interesting things that people resonate on, because obviously talent is gigantically important. And even now, when, we have this maybe recession or maybe not recession, employment keeps going up. And so finding great people is absolutely critical. And the difficulty that you see is that companies keep going to the same sources for their talent. And that can't possibly be the right thing to do, because it's such a wide world of potential talent. So I talk about untapped talent pools, looking for people that maybe others have not considered a bypass. You mentioned Bill Walsh. In that case, there was ex-NFL football players that had the aspiration, the potential to join a coaching staff, but had not been given an opportunity at that time because they happened to be Black. And he thought that was completely nuts and opened the door and created all kinds of different activities. I ask groups all the time, so what are some potential untapped talent pools that you could think of that maybe you should, and your organization or your team should be looking at? And it's pretty interesting when you start to open up the door for that type of creativity, and you hear all sorts of things. And I get lots of examples. The most common example I've ever seen is servers in restaurants. Why? Well, what makes a good server? A good server doesn't just kind of get the order right, although you hope that happens. But, they talk to you, they engage with you, but they don't do too much. And they read you so that they know that if you're busy or you're talking with your group that's having dinner, you don't want them to intrude too much. But sometimes you do like to have that banter. And what's that skill set? That's called customer relationship skill. That has huge leverageability in other places. And I've got lots and lots of examples from people who told me that they were at a restaurant, they had a great server. They thought he or she was great, had huge potential. And next thing you know, they're offering them a job in the company. And many of those stories end with and they've been promoted 3 times.
Well, thank you, Sydney, for sharing all these great insights with me today. Really appreciate it. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
So I like to say I don't play hard to get. You can find me all over the place. I'm obviously on LinkedIn, and that's actually the primary place I go, but you can find my website, my books. I have a series of online courses on Coursera, and the easiest thing is you start Googling and you discover, oh yeah, there he is. And of course, my podcast, which is called The Sidcast. That's why the Sidcast. It's been great fun. So I'd really enjoyed this conversation and the questions you've been asking, Charles, because it's engaging. I'm usually on the other side of that. And so it's always fun to see someone asking a really good question. So those are some of the ways you can find me.
Thank you, Sydney, for joining me today, and look forward to your upcoming IMS program.
Me too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into this topic and all the tips and tools that were shared. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. As always, you can head over to my LinkedIn page where you can see all the latest articles and posts from me. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. I look forward to serving you in the next episode, so hit subscribe and I'll see you then. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.